Kale's lungs burned as she pushed through the wet branches, her bare feet cutting on stones she could not see in the dark. Behind her, far off but not far enough, a horn sounded through the trees, low and deep, the kind of sound that made every living thing in the forest go still. She knew that horn. She had heard it 100 times from the high walls of Blackthorn Hall, calling hunters home at dusk. Tonight it was calling hunters after her. She did not stop running. 3 days ago she had been sitting in a cold stone room, while men argued over her future, as if she were a piece of land to be divided. 3 days ago, King Draven had looked at her across that room with those pale gray eyes and said, in a voice too calm for what it meant, that the wedding would happen at the next full moon, whether she agreed to it or not. She remembered the way her whole body had gone cold at those words. She remembered thinking, with a clarity that surprised her, that she would rather die in the forest than become his. So she had waited until the middle of the night, slipped past the guard who dozed at his post, and run. Now, hours later, her dress torn at the hem and her hair full of leaves, she pressed herself against the trunk of an old oak and tried to slow her breathing. The horn sounded again, closer this time. She could hear the distant crash of hooves through undergrowth, and beneath that, something worse. A low growl carried on the wind, not from one throat but from many. Wolves, not wild ones. His. Kale pushed off the tree and ran again, angling downhill toward the sound of moving water. If she could reach the river, she could break her scent trail. It was a trick she had read about once in an old book from the hall's library, back when she still had the freedom to sit in a library and read whatever she liked. She had never imagined she would need to use it to save her own life. The ground grew steeper, and roots reached up out of the darkness to catch her ankles. She stumbled once, caught herself on a low branch, and kept moving. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. Somewhere behind her, a wolf howled, and 3 more answered it, and the sound rolled through the trees like thunder. She reached the river faster than she expected, breaking out of the trees onto a muddy bank where the water ran fast and black under a thin slice of moon. It was colder than she had thought it would be. She did not hesitate. She waded in up to her knees, gasping at the cold, then deeper, letting the current tug at her skirts, and began to move downstream, staying close to the bank where the water would not sweep her off her feet. For a while it worked. The howling grew distant, then faded almost to nothing, swallowed by the sound of rushing water. Kale allowed herself a small, shaking breath of hope. Maybe she really could do this. Maybe there was a life somewhere beyond Blackthorn territory, where no one had ever heard the name Draven, where she could be nothing more than a woman with no past, free to build whatever future she wanted. She climbed out of the river a mile down, teeth chattering, and pressed herself against a boulder to catch her breath. The forest around her had changed character, the trees older and closer together, moss hanging from their branches like gray hair. She did not know this part of the woods. She only knew it lay in the direction away from Blackthorn Hall, and for now, that was enough. She had almost caught her breath when she heard it. Not a horn, not a howl. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere close, moving with a confidence that told her whoever it was had not been running at all. Kale froze, pressing herself flatter against the boulder, praying the shadows would hide her. "You made it further than I expected." The voice cut through the dark like a blade, calm and low, and every hair on Kale's body rose at the sound of it. She knew that voice. She had heard it across a stone room 3 nights ago, promising her a future she had run from ever since. She turned, slowly, and there he was. King Draven stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and still, his dark coat catching what little moonlight filtered through the canopy. He was not out of breath. He did not look like a man who had spent hours chasing a runaway omega through wet forest. He looked, infuriatingly, like a man who had known exactly where she would end up before she did. "How?" Kale managed, her voice cracking. "How did you find me?" "You forget what I am," Draven said, taking a slow step forward. "A river hides your scent from ordinary noses. It does not hide it from mine." Kale's mind raced. Behind her was the river, fast and cold and dangerous in the dark. Ahead of her was him. To her left, dense trees she might be able to lose herself in if she moved quickly enough. She measured the distance with her eyes, and Draven, watching her closely, seemed to read the thought before she had fully formed it. "Don't," he said. and there was something underneath the single word that was not quite a threat and not quite a plea. You will not survive the river a second time tonight, not in your condition. My condition, Cale repeated bitterly. You mean the condition of being terrified of you. Something flickered across his face, there and gone so fast, she almost missed it. I mean the condition of being exhausted, cold, and alone in a forest that does not care whether you live or die. I am not your enemy, Cale. You locked doors on me. You told me I had no choice in my own life. If that is not an enemy, I don't know what you call it. Draven's jaw tightened, but he did not argue the point. Instead, he took another step closer, slow, careful, the way one might approach a wounded animal that could still bite. I am not here to drag you back in chains. I only want you to be safe. Safe, Cale said, and the word came out as something close to a laugh, sharp and humorless. You want me safe in a cage with a lock only you hold the key to. For a moment, neither of them moved. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the distant rush of the river and the wind moving high in the branches. Cale studied his face in the moonlight, searching for the cruelty she had been warned about since she was a child, the cruelty that was supposed to define him. What she found instead was something more complicated, a tightness around his eyes that looked almost like worry, though she refused to let herself believe that. You do not know me, Draven said quietly. You have been told stories about me your whole life, and you have decided those stories are the truth without ever asking whether they are. I know enough, Cale shot back. I know you never once asked what I wanted. I know you decided my future in a room I wasn't even invited into. That is enough for me to know exactly who you are. Draven's eyes flickered, and for a moment Cale thought she saw real hurt there, quickly buried beneath his usual composure. There are reasons for the choices I have made that you do not understand. I will not force those reasons on you tonight, in the middle of a forest, freezing and afraid. But I am asking you, not ordering you, to come back with me. Whatever you decide about our future can wait until you are warm and safe. Cale wanted to believe there was a difference between asking and ordering, when the man asking held every advantage, when refusing meant nothing, because he could simply take what he wanted anyway. But something in his voice made her hesitate, just for a moment, long enough for her body to remind her exactly how cold and tired she truly was. That hesitation was all he needed. Before she could decide whether to run again, 4 shapes emerged from the trees behind Draven, his enforcers, silent and watchful, closing the last open paths through the forest. Cale's heart sank. She had known, somewhere beneath her hope, that outrunning an Alpha King and his pack alone in unfamiliar woods had never truly been a fair fight. She had simply refused to accept that until this exact moment, with nowhere left to run. You planned this, she said, looking back at Draven. You let me get this far on purpose. I let you have your run, he said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only a strange, quiet honesty. I know what it means to you, to prove to yourself that you tried. But little mate, running was never going to change what already exists between us. It only delayed it. The words little mate landed like a physical blow, and Cale flinched. Don't call me that. It is what you are, Draven said simply, whether either of us likes the timing of it. Cale looked past him at the 4 enforcers waiting silently in the trees, then at the black river rushing behind her, and finally back at the king who had somehow, impossibly, found her in the middle of nowhere, as though the forest itself had been leading her straight into his hands. She thought of every version of freedom she had imagined over the last 3 days, every quiet fantasy of a life with no crown, no cage, no name that made people bow their heads and lower their eyes. All of it dissolved into the cold night air. If I come with you, she said, lifting her chin even as her whole body shook with cold and exhaustion, it is because I have no other choice tonight, not because I have accepted anything. Something like respect passed briefly across Draven's face. Understood, he said. He did not smile, did not gloat, did not do any of the things she had expected a cruel king to do upon finally catching his prey. Instead, he removed his coat and held it out to her, an offering rather than a command. Cale stared at it for a long moment before finally, reluctantly, closing the distance between them and taking it. The fabric was warm from his body, and despite everything, despite every reason she had to hate him, she felt a small, treacherous flicker of relief at the warmth. This is not over, she said quietly. pulling the coat around her shoulders. No, Draven agreed, his gaze steady on hers, in a way that made her stomach twist with something she refused to name. It is only beginning. Behind them, the enforcers began to move, forming a loose circle that was somehow both an escort and a cage. Kale walked among them with her head high, refusing to let her fear show, refusing to let her exhaustion bend her spine. She did not know what waited for her back at Blackthorn Hall. She did not know what Draven truly wanted from her beyond the bond that fate had apparently decided for both of them. But she knew one thing, with absolute certainty, as the trees thinned and the distant lights of the hall came into view through the dark. She was not done fighting, not by far. The walk back felt longer than the run away had, every step heavier, with the weight of failure, of a freedom glimpsed, and then taken away. Draven walked beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him even through his coat, but he did not touch her, did not try to hold her arm or force her pace. He simply matched her steps, silent, watchful, as though giving her whatever small dignity remained to her after a night of running and losing. When they finally reached the edge of Blackthorn territory, the great iron gates loomed out of the darkness, torches burning along the top of the wall, throwing long shadows across the muddy road. Kale felt her stomach clench at the sight of them. 3 days ago, those gates had represented everything she was fleeing. Now they represented her failure to escape it. "They will not punish you," Draven said quietly, as if he had read the fear written plainly across her face. "No one will lay a hand on you for running, I give you my word." Kale looked at him sideways, searching his expression for the lie she expected to find there. She found none, though that meant little to her. Words were easy, actions were what mattered, and so far his actions had only ever taken choices away from her, one after another, until she had nothing left but the clothes on her back and a coat that was not even hers. The gates groaned open, and the enforcers led them through into the wide stone courtyard beyond. Torchlight flickered against the high walls, and somewhere above, a window opened, a face peering down, before quickly disappearing again. Word would spread through the hall by morning, Kale knew. The Omega who had run from the king, caught and brought back before the sun rose. She could already imagine the whispers, the pitying looks, the quiet judgments from people who had never once asked her what she wanted for her own life. Draven led her not toward the dungeons she had half expected, but toward the private wing of the hall, a part of the building she had only glimpsed from a distance during her time there. The corridors here were quieter, the stone floors covered in soft rugs that muffled their footsteps, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and something else she could not quite name. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, though her voice had lost some of its earlier fire, worn down by cold and exhaustion. "Somewhere warm," Draven said simply. "Somewhere you can rest. Tomorrow, when you are not freezing and half asleep on your feet, we will speak properly about what happens next." Kale wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers immediately, but her body had other ideas. The adrenaline that had carried her through hours of running was finally draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made her legs feel unsteady beneath her. She said nothing, as Draven opened a heavy wooden door and gestured for her to enter. The room beyond was larger than any bedroom she had ever slept in, a fire already crackling in the hearth despite the late hour, as though someone had known she would need its warmth. A large bed sat against one wall, piled with blankets, and a small table held a tray of food that Kale's stomach growled at the sight of, reminding her she had not eaten properly in over a day. "This is your room," Draven said, standing in the doorway rather than entering. "Not a cell, not a cage, whatever you might think of me. You are free to move within the hall as you wish. I will not lock this door." Kale turned to look at him, searching once again for some hidden motive, some trap she had not yet spotted. "And if I try to run again?" Draven's expression grew serious, though not unkind. "Then I imagine I will find you again. I would prefer, little mate, that neither of us has to go through that a second time. But I will not chain you to stop you from trying. That was never who I wanted to be with you." Before she could respond, he stepped back and pulled the door closed behind him, leaving her alone in the warm, unfamiliar room. Kale stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the closed door, half expecting to hear the click of a lock that never came. When it did not, she moved slowly to test the handle herself, and found, to her genuine surprise, that it turned freely beneath her hand. She was not locked in. That single fact unsettled her more than any cage could have. A cage she understood. A cage confirmed everything she had believed about him, everything she had been warned about her whole life. An open door confirmed nothing, except that the man who had chased her through a forest and caught her against her will was somehow far more complicated than the monster she had built in her mind. Kale sank onto the edge of the bed, pulling Draven's coat tighter around her shoulders despite the warmth of the fire, and stared into the flames until her eyes grew heavy and her thoughts grew slow. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would think clearly again. Tomorrow, she would find another way to fight for the life she wanted. Tonight, exhausted beyond words, she simply closed her eyes and let sleep take her. The sound of the crackling fire the last thing she heard before darkness claimed her. Outside her door, unseen, Draven remained standing in the corridor for a long while, one hand pressed flat against the old wood, his expression unreadable in the dim torchlight. Somewhere deep in his chest, a feeling he had not allowed himself in years stirred and refused to settle, and he found himself wondering, not for the first time that night, whether catching her had truly been a victory at all, or simply the beginning of a much longer battle he was not certain he knew how to win. Kale woke to sunlight pouring through tall windows she did not remember falling asleep near, and for one confused moment, she forgot where she was. The unfamiliar softness of the bed, the smell of wood smoke still lingering from the dying fire, the weight of a coat that was not hers draped over her shoulders, all of it rushed back at once, and her stomach dropped with the memory of the night before. She had run. She had been caught. She was back inside Blackthorn Hall. Kale sat up slowly, testing her body for the aches she expected after hours of running through forest and river. Her legs were sore, her feet scratched and tender, but someone had cleaned and bandaged the worst of the cuts while she slept, though she had no memory of it happening. She glanced toward the door, half expecting a guard to be standing watch on the other side, but when she rose and pulled it open, the corridor beyond was empty and quiet, morning light slanting through narrow windows along its length. A folded set of clothes sat on a chair near the fireplace, simple but well made, along with a note in careful handwriting that read only, "For when you are ready." There was no signature, but she did not need one. She dressed quickly, grateful for dry fabric against her skin, and stood for a long moment staring at Draven's coat still draped across the bed, before finally deciding to leave it behind. She did not want to carry anything of his with her, even something as small as a coat, into whatever conversation waited for her that morning. She found her way through the quiet corridors mostly by instinct, following the smell of food, until she reached a wide dining hall, where a long table sat mostly empty, except for a single place set near the head. Draven was not there. Instead, a young woman with warm brown skin and dark curling hair looked up from arranging plates and offered Kale a small, careful smile. "You're awake," the woman said. "I'm Priya. I look after the private wing." She gestured toward the empty seat. "The king thought you might want to eat, before anyone bothered you with questions." Kale hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to trust the kindness in the woman's voice. "Where is he?" "Handling pack business," Priya said, already pulling out the chair for her. "He said to tell you he would find you later, when you were ready to talk, not before." It was such a small thing, that consideration, and yet it needled at Kale more than she wanted to admit. She had built an image of Draven over years of stories and warnings, a man defined entirely by control and cruelty, and every hour she spent inside these walls seemed determined to chip away at that image piece by piece, whether she wanted it to or not. She sat, mostly out of exhaustion rather than trust, and allowed Priya to fill her plate with warm bread and fruit and a rich stew that smelled better than anything she had eaten in days. For a while, she simply ate in silence, aware of Priya moving quietly around the room, tidying things that did not need tidying, clearly present in case Kale wanted to talk, but careful not to push. "Can I ask you something?" Kale finally said, setting down her spoon. Priya paused, glancing over. "Of course. Is he really as cruel as everyone says he is?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and Priya's expression grew thoughtful, rather than immediately defensive, which surprised Kale more than an outright denial would have. "He is hard," Priya said slowly, choosing her words with obvious care. "He has had to be, since he was young. Ruling this pack was never simple, and he inherited more trouble than most kings ever face. but cruel. She shook her head. I have worked in this hall for 6 years. I have seen him make difficult choices. Choices that cost him sleep. Choices that made him someone people fear. I have never once seen him be cruel for the sake of being cruel. He locked me out of every choice about my own future, Cale said, an edge creeping back into her voice. That feels cruel enough to me. Priya was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler. I won't pretend to know everything that happened between the two of you, or what led you to run last night. That's not my place. But I will say this. Whatever he's done, I don't think it came from wanting to hurt you. I think it came from being afraid of losing something he doesn't fully understand yet either. Cale did not respond, though the words settled uncomfortably in her chest, refusing to be easily dismissed. She finished her meal in silence, and when Priya offered to show her around the parts of the hall she was free to explore, Cale accepted, mostly to give herself something to do besides sit alone with her thoughts. The hall, she discovered over the following hour, was larger than she had ever realized during her earlier, more restricted visits. Priya walked her through wide libraries filled with old books, past training yards where young pack members practiced under the watchful eyes of instructors, and along a covered walkway that looked out over gardens blooming with flowers Cale did not recognize. Everywhere they went, people glanced at her, some with open curiosity, others quickly looking away, clearly having already heard the story of her failed escape. They're not judging you, Priya said quietly, noticing Cale's discomfort. Most of them just don't know what to make of an Omega, bold enough to run from an Alpha King. Half of them are impressed. The other half are terrified for you. And which half are you? Cale asked. Priya's smile turned a little wry. Honestly, both. They had reached a quiet corner of the garden when a new voice cut through the morning air, sharp and confident, in a way that immediately put Cale on edge. So this is her, the little Omega who thought she could outrun the king. Cale turned to find a tall man approaching, broad-shouldered and handsome in a hard, calculated way, dressed in fine, dark clothing that marked him as someone of importance within the pack. His eyes swept over her with open assessment, and Priya's posture beside her stiffened noticeably. Lord Calix, Priya said, her voice suddenly much more formal. I don't believe the king has authorized any visitors yet. I'm not a visitor, Calix said smoothly, his gaze never leaving Cale. I'm family, or close enough to it. He offered Cale a smile that did not reach his eyes. Draven's cousin. I've heard so much about you these past few days. The whole hall has, really. It's not often someone manages to make our king chase them through the forest in the middle of the night. I didn't do it for entertainment, Cale said coolly, refusing to let his tone unsettle her. Calix's smile widened slightly, as though her sharpness pleased him rather than offended him. No, I don't suppose you did. Tell me, little Omega, has anyone explained to you exactly why our dear king is so determined to keep you close? Or has he simply expected you to accept his word for it? Something about the way he said it, the deliberate emphasis, the barely hidden satisfaction, made Cale's stomach tighten with unease. What do you mean? Calix opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, another voice cut through the garden, low and unmistakably dangerous. Calix. Draven stood at the edge of the path, his expression carefully neutral, though Cale could see something tighter beneath the calm, something that made even Calix's confident posture falter slightly. I was simply welcoming our newest guest, Calix said, spreading his hands in a gesture of false innocence. Surely that's not forbidden, cousin. It is today, Draven said flatly. He did not raise his voice, did not move any closer, but something in his tone made it clear the conversation was already over. Calix held his gaze for a moment longer, some silent challenge passing between them, before finally inclining his head toward Cale with mock politeness and walking away, leaving an uncomfortable silence behind him. I apologize for that, Draven said once his cousin had disappeared around the corner of the garden wall. Calix enjoys stirring trouble where he can find it. I should have warned you he might try to speak with you. What did he mean? Cale asked, unwilling to let the moment pass unexamined. About there being a reason you're so determined to keep me close. Is there something you haven't told me? Draven's expression grew guarded, and for a moment Cale thought he might deflect the question entirely. Instead, he glanced toward Priya, who quietly excused herself and slipped away down the garden path, leaving the two of them alone among the flowering shrubs and quiet birdsong. There is more to explain than I could manage last night, in the middle of a forest, Draven said carefully. Some of it concerns matters older than either of us, tied to the founding of this pack, and the bonds that hold it together. I did not withhold it from you to control you, Kale, whatever you might believe. I withheld it because it is not a simple story, and I did not want to burden you with it while you were exhausted and afraid. I'm not exhausted right now, Kale said, crossing her arms. Tell me. For a long moment, Draven studied her, as though weighing how much truth she was ready to hear. Then he sighed, a small, tired sound that seemed to carry more weight than his usual composed silence. Walk with me, he said. It is not a short story, and I would rather tell it properly than in pieces. Kale hesitated only a moment, before falling into step beside him, curiosity finally outweighing her caution. As they walked deeper into the garden, away from the hall and its watching windows, Draven began to speak, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of something he had clearly carried alone for a long time. 3 generations ago, he began, this pack nearly tore itself apart in a war between rival bloodlines. My great-grandfather ended that war, but only through a bond made between 2 families, a promise that their lines would remain tied together for as long as the pack survived, to prevent the kind of fracture that had almost destroyed everyone. That promise did not fade with time. It became something deeper, something the pack's magic itself recognizes now, whether any of us fully understand how or why. Kale listened, her earlier anger slowly giving way to a wary curiosity. And I'm part of that bloodline. You are the last of it, on your side, Draven said quietly. Which means the bond between us is not simply a matter of my preference, or even the pack's tradition. It is tied to something older, something that keeps the peace this territory has known for 3 generations. If that bond is broken, I cannot promise what happens to that peace. So none of this was ever really about me, Kale said slowly, something cold settling in her chest. It was about keeping your pack from falling apart. That's not what I said, Draven replied, stopping and turning to face her fully, his gray eyes intense in the morning light. I will not pretend the bond does not matter for the pack's stability, it does. But that is not why I chased you through a forest last night, Kale, and it is not why I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the moment I first saw you in that stone room 3 days ago. Kale's breath caught slightly at the raw honesty in his voice, so different from the cold command she had expected from him that first day. Then why? She asked quietly. Draven was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, as though the answer cost him something to admit even to himself. I don't fully know how to explain it, he finally said. Only that something in me recognized something in you, the moment I saw you, long before any bond or bloodline gave me a reason to. I have spent 3 days trying to convince myself that reason alone should be enough to explain why I cannot let you walk away. It has not been enough, not even close. Kale did not know what to say to that, the honesty in his voice unsettling something inside her that she had been carefully guarding since the moment she first learned of the marriage arranged against her will. She looked away, toward the flowering shrubs and the distant wall of the hall, trying to find her footing again, amid feelings she had not expected to feel. I still don't forgive you, she said finally, though the words carried less certainty than they had the night before, for taking my choices away. I don't expect you to, Draven said quietly, but I am asking you to let me earn something better than fear from you, going forward. Not because tradition demands it, because I want to. The garden around them fell quiet, except for the distant call of birds and the soft rustle of wind through the flowers, and Kale found herself, despite everything, unable to look away from the sincerity written plainly across his face. Days passed slowly inside Blackthorn Hall, each one blending into the next, in a way that unsettled Kale more than she wanted to admit. She had expected chains, guards at every door, a life measured out in restrictions. Instead, she found something far harder to fight against, a quiet, patient kindness that chipped away at the wall she had built around herself since the night she first learned her future had been decided without her. She spent her mornings in the hall's library, losing herself in books the way she had as a child, before duty and bloodlines had ever entered her life. In the afternoons, Priya often found her, and the 2 women had settled into an easy companionship that surprised Kale with how quickly it had grown. She learned that Priya had lost her own family young, taken in by the pack when she had nowhere else to go, and that she had chosen to stay in service at the hall not out of obligation, but because she had genuinely come to care for the people within its walls. "You don't have to trust him yet," Priya told her one afternoon, as they sat together in the garden beneath the shade of a wide flowering tree. "But you should know that not everyone here is what the stories say. Most of us are just people, trying to live decent lives under difficult circumstances." "That's easy to say, when the king isn't deciding your entire future for you," Kale replied, though the edge in her voice had softened considerably over the past week. Priya only smiled, unbothered by the sharpness. "Maybe. But I've also seen him give up things most people would never sacrifice, for the sake of this pack's peace. He's not perfect. He's made mistakes with you, real ones, but he's trying now, in his own way, to fix them." Kale did not respond, though she turned the words over in her mind, long after Priya had left her alone with her book. She had noticed it herself, in small ways she almost hated to admit. Draven no longer summoned her to formal meetings with cold, distant instructions. Instead, he sought her out in the evenings, sometimes only for a few minutes, asking about her day, listening more than he spoke, never once pushing the topic of the bond or the wedding that had once loomed over her like a sentence. It should have made things easier. Instead, it made everything more complicated, because the anger she had relied on to keep herself steady was slowly, quietly, being replaced by something far more dangerous to her resolve. It was on the 7th evening since her return that everything shifted again. Kale had been walking alone through the eastern corridor, one of the quieter parts of the hall she had discovered during her explorations, when she overheard voices coming from behind a half-closed door. She recognized Calix's voice immediately, low and urgent, speaking to someone she could not identify. "She's more trouble than she's worth, and you know it," Calix was saying. "The bond is a formality. If she disappeared tomorrow, the pack would find another way to secure the peace. There are other bloodlines, other options, if someone were willing to look for them." "And you'd be the one looking, I suppose," a second voice replied, dry and unimpressed. Kale recognized this voice too, though it took her a moment to place it as belonging to one of Draven's senior enforcers, a stern woman named Halen, who Kale had passed in the halls but never spoken with directly. "I'm simply saying that if the girl were to vanish, quietly, no one would need to know how or why," Calix said. "Draven's grief would fade in time. The pack's stability would be secured through other means. Everyone benefits." "Everyone except her," Halen said sharply. "And you'd better hope Draven never hears you say something like that out loud, Calix, because I promise you, cousin or not, he would not forgive it." Kale's blood ran cold as she stood frozen in the corridor, her hand pressed against the stone wall to steady herself. She had suspected Calix disliked her from the moment they first met, but this was something else entirely, something with teeth, a threat spoken so casually it made her stomach twist with fear. She did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked quickly away from the door, her heart pounding, her mind racing through what she had just heard. By the time she reached her own room, she was shaking, though whether from fear or fury, she could not entirely say. She had to tell Draven. Whatever complicated feelings she still carried about him, about the bond, about the future she had never chosen, none of that mattered next to the fact that his own cousin had just spoken openly about wanting her gone, in whatever way that word truly meant. She found him later that evening in his private study, a room she had visited only once before, tucked away in the quieter part of the hall's administrative wing. He looked up from a stack of papers when she entered, his expression shifting immediately from mild surprise to concern at whatever he saw written across her face. "Kale, what's wrong?" She told him everything, the words spilling out faster than she intended, the conversation she had overheard, the casual cruelty in Calix's voice, the way Halen had warned him, without ever fully denying the danger of what he was suggesting. Draven's expression darkened with every word, his jaw tightening, his hands curling slowly into fists against the surface of his desk. "He said that," Draven repeated quietly, once she had finished, his voice dangerously calm, in a way that reminded her, for the first time since her return, of exactly why people feared him. In the hall, where anyone might have heard him. "I heard him," Kale said. "That's the point. He doesn't seem to think anyone would care enough to stop him." Draven rose from his desk, moving with a controlled tension that made the air in the room feel suddenly heavier. "He is wrong," he said, and there was something in his voice, some deep current of protectiveness that Cale had not expected to hear directed at her, not after everything that had passed between them. I will speak with him tonight. Whatever grievance he holds against this bond, against you, it ends now. Why does he hate the idea of the bond so much? Cale asked, watching him carefully. What does he gain by wanting me gone? Draven's expression flickered, something complicated passing behind his eyes before he answered. Calix believes he should have inherited leadership of this pack, not me. Our fathers were brothers, but mine was older, and the bloodline passed to me instead of him. He has never fully accepted that. If the bond between us fails, if the pack's stability is threatened by my failure to secure it, there are those who might argue the leadership should pass to someone else, someone like him. Understanding settled over Cale like a cold weight. So this was never only about tradition, or the bond, or even about you. It's about power. He wants me gone, so your rule looks weak enough to challenge. Likely, yes, Draven admitted grimly, though I did not want to burden you with pack politics, on top of everything else you have already had to accept these past weeks. I think I've earned the right to know when someone in your own family wants me disappeared, Cale said, sharper than she intended, though Draven did not flinch from the words. You have, he agreed quietly, and I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. I did not think he would be reckless enough to speak so openly. That was my mistake to make, and I will correct it. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, closer than he usually allowed himself to stand, close enough that Cale could see the tension still coiled tightly beneath his composed exterior. I need you to promise me something, he said quietly. What? If you notice anything else, anything at all that feels wrong, you come to me immediately, not to Priya, not to anyone else in this hall, no matter how much you trust them, to me. I cannot protect you from what I do not know is happening. Cale studied his face for a long moment, searching for the calculation she had expected to find there during her first days in the hall. The cold self-interest she had been warned defined him entirely. She found instead only a raw, unguarded worry that struck her as far more convincing than any promise he could have spoken aloud. All right, she said finally. I promise. Something in his shoulders eased slightly at her answer, though the tension around his eyes remained. Thank you, he said quietly. And Cale, whatever Calix believes about the value of this bond, whatever politics surround it, I need you to understand something clearly. You are not a formality to me. You have not been since the moment I first saw you. I know I have given you little reason to believe that, given how our beginning unfolded, but it is the truth, whether you choose to believe it or not. Cale did not answer immediately, the weight of his words settling over her in a way that left her more unsettled than any threat Calix could have made. Part of her, the part still guarding itself carefully after years of having her future decided by others, wanted to dismiss his words as another attempt at control, softer and more convincing than his earlier commands, but control nonetheless. But another part of her, growing steadily louder with each day she spent inside these walls, wondered if perhaps she had been wrong to assume the worst of him so completely, so quickly, before ever giving him the chance to prove otherwise. I need time, she finally said, to think about all of this. About what it means, about what I actually want, separate from what everyone around me seems to want for me. Take whatever time you need, Draven said, stepping back to give her space, though his eyes remained fixed on hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite herself. I will not rush you, Cale. Not again. She left his study that evening with far more questions than answers, her mind spinning with the revelation of Calix's ambitions, with Draven's unexpected honesty, with the slow, unwelcome realization that the simple story she had told herself about her own life, prisoner and captor, victim and villain, no longer fit the reality unfolding around her. Outside, as she made her way back through the quiet corridors toward her room, she did not notice the figure watching from the shadows of a side passage, nor did she notice the way his expression twisted with something cold and calculating as he watched her disappear around the corner, already turning over new plans in his mind, now that his earlier ones had clearly been discovered. Calix waited until the corridor was empty, before finally stepping back into the light, a thin, humorless smile playing at the corners of his mouth. If direct suggestion would not remove the Omega from his path, he would simply have to find another way, one far less likely to be traced back to him, one that would leave Draven with no choice but to see her as the burden Calix had always known her to be. He turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the hall, already planning his next move, while behind him, entirely unaware, Kale continued toward her room, carrying with her the fragile, dangerous beginnings of trust in a man she had once run from with everything she had. A week passed after the confrontation in Draven's study, and on the surface, life inside Blackthorn Hall settled into something almost peaceful. Calix had grown quieter, more careful, avoiding Kale entirely whenever their paths might have crossed, and Kale allowed herself to believe, cautiously, that Draven's warning to his cousin had been enough to end the danger before it truly began. She should have known better. The trouble began with an invitation, delivered by a young messenger Kale did not recognize, asking her to meet Priya at the edge of the Eastern Gardens, just after midday, near a section of the grounds Kale had not yet explored. The note was written in a hand that looked close enough to Priya's usual careful script that Kale did not think twice before agreeing, slipping away from the library where she had spent her morning and making her way toward the gardens alone. The eastern grounds, she discovered, were wilder than the manicured gardens closer to the hall, bordered by a low stone wall that marked the edge of cultivated land before the forest began again beyond it. She waited near the wall for several minutes, growing increasingly confused when there was no sign of Priya anywhere nearby. "She's not coming." Kale spun around at the voice, her stomach dropping when she found Calix standing several feet away, blocking the path back toward the hall, his expression carrying none of the false charm he usually wore in public. "What is this?" Kale demanded, taking an instinctive step backward toward the wall. "A conversation," Calix said, "that should have happened weeks ago, before you managed to worm your way so thoroughly into my cousin's good graces." He took a slow step forward, and Kale's heart began to pound as she realized how isolated this part of the grounds truly was, how unlikely it was that anyone would hear her if she called for help. "I underestimated you, I'll admit. I thought you'd be gone within days, either by choice or by circumstance. Instead, here you are, still standing, still smiling at my cousin, like the two of you might actually build something real. If you have a problem with me, take it up with Draven directly," Kale said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. "Not like this." "Oh, I intend to," Calix said, an unsettling calm settling over his features. "But first, I needed to know exactly what kind of threat you truly represent. Whether you're simply a frightened girl playing along until she finds another chance to run, or whether you've genuinely decided to plant yourself here, in my family's legacy, permanently." He took another step closer, and Kale's back pressed against the cold stone of the low wall behind her, nowhere left to retreat. "Either way," Calix continued, "I think it's time you understood exactly how precarious your position here truly is. Bonds can be broken, little Omega. Bloodlines can find other paths, given the right circumstances. And accidents unfortunately happen far too often in wild country like this." The threat in his words was unmistakable now, and Kale's mind raced for any option, any escape, aware of the forest beginning just beyond the low wall at her back, aware of how far she was from anyone who might help her. She thought of the night she had run before, of the cold river and the desperate hope of freedom, and wondered bitterly if she was about to find herself in danger, for the second time, in as many weeks, this time with no king tracking her scent to pull her back to safety. "Touch me," she said, lifting her chin despite her racing heart. "And Draven will know exactly who is responsible. Do you really think he won't figure it out?" Something flickered across Calix's face. A brief flash of uncertainty quickly smoothed back into confidence. "Accidents are rarely so easily traced, little Omega. Especially accidents that happen to reckless young women wandering alone near dangerous forest paths." Before Kale could respond, a new voice rang out sharply across the garden. "Calix!" Both of them turned to find Halen striding toward them, her expression thunderous, several other enforcers close behind her. Calix's carefully maintained calm cracked visibly at the sight of them, though he recovered quickly, stepping back from Kale with a smooth, practiced smile that did nothing to hide the tension in his shoulders. "Just having a friendly conversation," he said lightly. "No harm done." "The king wants to see you," Halen said, her voice cold enough that even Kale felt a chill at the sound of it. "Now." Calix's eyes flicked once more to Kale, something dark and unfinished still lingering in his gaze, before he finally turned and walked toward the hall, flanked closely by the enforcers Halen had brought with her. Once he was out of earshot, Halen turned to Cale, her expression softening slightly with concern. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No," Cale said, though her voice shook slightly as the adrenaline of the encounter began to fade, leaving her legs unsteady beneath her. "How did you know to come?" Priya found the real note in her room, the one that was supposed to reach you, still sitting where she'd left it, and realized someone had sent you a forgery instead. She came straight to me. Halen's jaw tightened. "You're lucky she noticed when she did." Cale let out a shaky breath, gratitude and lingering fear warring inside her chest. "Thank you," she managed, "for coming." Halen nodded once, brisk and businesslike, though something in her expression suggested the warning she had given Calix in that earlier overheard conversation had not been an idle one. "The king will want to hear everything that happened here, in detail. Come with me." They found Draven waiting in the same study where Cale had told him about Calix's earlier threats, though his expression now carried none of the controlled calm from that previous conversation. He rose immediately when Cale entered, crossing the room in several quick strides, his hands settling gently on her shoulders, as his eyes searched her face for any sign of injury. "Halen told me what happened," he said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "Are you certain you're unharmed?" "I'm fine," Cale assured him, though the warmth of his hands on her shoulders, the raw worry, written so plainly across his face, unsettled something inside her that she had not expected to feel in this moment of lingering fear. "He didn't touch me." Halen arrived before he could do anything. Draven's jaw tightened further at her words, and he stepped back, though his hands lingered a moment longer than necessary, before finally falling away. "This ends today," he said, turning toward Halen. "Bring him to the main hall. All of the senior pack members should hear this." What followed was unlike anything Cale had witnessed during her time at Blackthorn Hall. Word spread quickly, and by the time Draven had assembled the senior members of the pack in the Great Hall, a tense crowd had gathered, murmuring uncertainly, as Calix was brought before them, his usual confidence notably absent. Draven stood at the head of the hall, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority Cale had not fully witnessed until this moment, cold and absolute, the voice of a king, rather than the quiet, careful man she had come to know over the past weeks. "My cousin lured my mate to an isolated part of these grounds under false pretenses and threatened her safety," he said, his words ringing clearly through the silent hall. "This is not the first time he has spoken of wishing her harm. I have given him chances to correct his behavior. He has chosen, instead, to escalate it." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, and Cale, standing slightly behind Draven, felt the weight of dozens of eyes shifting between her and Calix, who stood pale and tight-lipped before the assembled pack. "I did nothing that would have truly harmed her," Calix said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I only wished to speak with her plainly, to understand her intentions." "You threatened her with an accident," Draven said flatly. "Words I do not believe were spoken carelessly, given everything Halen overheard from you previously." He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle fully over the hall before continuing. "As of today, you are stripped of your standing within this pack's leadership. You will leave Blackthorn territory by week's end, and will not return without my explicit permission." Calix's face went through several rapid transformations, disbelief giving way to fury, before finally settling into something colder and more dangerous. "You would exile your own family," he said quietly, "for the sake of an Omega you've known for less than a month." "I would protect my mate from anyone who threatens her," Draven said, his voice carrying no hesitation whatsoever. "Family or otherwise. That should not surprise you, Calix. It is exactly what you would expect of any leader worth following." The hall fell silent, the weight of Draven's words settling over the assembled pack members like a physical presence. Calix said nothing further, his expression twisting with barely contained resentment, before he finally turned and allowed himself to be led away by the enforcers waiting near the hall's entrance. Once the hall had begun to empty, the tension slowly draining from the gathered crowd, Draven turned back to Cale, his expression softening from the cold authority he had shown moments before, into something far more uncertain. "I should have removed him from any position of influence the moment I learned what he had said to Halen," he said quietly. "I let family loyalty cloud my judgment. That mistake nearly cost you your safety today, and I am sorry for it." Kale studied him for a long moment, the events of the day settling slowly over her, the fear and adrenaline giving way to something quieter, more contemplative. "You didn't hesitate," she said finally. "In there. You chose me over your own cousin, without a second thought." "There was no choice to make," Draven said simply. "Not one I would have hesitated over, regardless of the cost." Something in his words, in the unwavering certainty behind them, settled deep into Kale's chest, and for the first time since the night she had run through the forest, desperate to escape a future she had never chosen, she found herself wondering if perhaps that future was not the cage she had once believed it to be. In the days following Calix's exile, something shifted inside Blackthorn Hall that Kale could not quite name, a lightness settling over the corridors that had not been there before, as though the entire pack had been holding its breath against some unspoken danger and could finally exhale. She noticed it in the way people greeted her now, warmer, more open, no longer measuring her with the wary curiosity of someone who might not stay. She noticed it most of all in herself. She had stopped counting the days since her failed escape. She had stopped, if she was honest with herself, thinking of her time at Blackthorn Hall as captivity at all. It frightened her, how easily that shift had happened. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after the confrontation in the Great Hall, Draven found her in the library, curled into a window seat with a book she had long since stopped reading, more content to watch the sun set over the training yards below than to focus on the words in front of her. He knocked lightly on the open door before entering, a habit she had noticed him keep consistently since her return, never once simply walking into a room she occupied without some small acknowledgement first. "May I join you?" he asked, and Kale, setting her book aside, nodded and shifted to make room on the wide window seat. For a while, they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade over the grounds below. It was Draven who finally broke the quiet, his voice softer than she was used to hearing from him, stripped of the authority he wore so easily in public. "I want to tell you something," he said, "that I have not told anyone else in this hall, not even Halen, who has served me faithfully since I was young." Kale turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "What is it?" Draven was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window. "When my father died and the leadership of this pack passed to me, I was younger than you are now. I had no preparation for what it meant to rule, no time to grieve properly, before the weight of an entire pack's survival settled onto my shoulders. I made mistakes in those early years, decisions I still carry the consequences of. I learned, very quickly, that showing weakness, showing uncertainty, invited exactly the kind of challenge Calix represented, so I built walls. I stopped allowing myself to want anything beyond what duty required of me." He turned to look at her then, his gray eyes carrying an openness she had rarely seen from him. "And then I met you, in that stone room, and every wall I had spent years building began to crack, almost immediately, in a way that terrified me far more than any political rival ever has." Kale's breath caught slightly at the raw honesty in his words. "That's why you were so cold, that first day," she said slowly, understanding dawning. "Not because you didn't care, because you did, and it frightened you." "Yes," Draven admitted quietly. "I told myself the bond was simply a matter of duty, of securing the pack's stability, because it was easier than admitting how quickly I had come to want something I had never allowed myself to want before. I handled it poorly. I gave you every reason to see me as the tyrant the stories paint me to be, when the truth was far more complicated, and far more frightening to me than simple cruelty ever could have been. I was terrified of you," Kale said quietly. "For weeks, I built my entire escape around the belief that you were a monster who would never let me choose anything for myself." "And now," Draven asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "what do you believe now?" Kale studied his face for a long moment, taking in the openness there, the vulnerability, so different from the composed authority he wore in front of the pack, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the answer came easily. "I believe," she said slowly, "that you are not the monster I was warned about. I believe you made mistakes, real ones, that hurt me. But I also believe you have spent every day since trying to correct them, without ever once demanding I forgive you for it." Something in Draven's expression eased at her words, a tension she had not fully realized he carried finally loosening. "I would understand," he said quietly, "if that is as far as your feelings ever go. I do not expect forgiveness simply because I have tried to earn it." "That's not what I said," Kale replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I said I believe you're trying. I didn't say my feelings have stopped there." Draven went very still at her words, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Kale, I don't fully understand what I feel," she admitted, the words coming slowly, carefully, as though she were discovering them for the first time, even as she spoke them aloud. "Weeks ago, I would have told you I felt nothing for you but fear and resentment. Now—" She paused, searching for words honest enough to match the moment. "Now I find myself looking forward to the evenings you seek me out. I find myself defending you, in my own mind, against the version of you I was warned about my whole life. I don't know what that means yet, but I don't think it's nothing." The silence that followed felt charged with something neither of them dared name too quickly, and Kale found herself acutely aware of how close they sat, of the warmth radiating from him, of the careful, restrained way he held himself even now, giving her space rather than closing the distance between them. "I will not rush this," Draven said finally, his voice rough with restraint. "Whatever this becomes, I want it built on something real, not on the bond's demands or the pack's expectations. You deserve that much, after everything." Kale felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words, a gentleness she had never expected to associate with the king, who had once seemed so cold and immovable. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for understanding that." They sat together a while longer as the last light faded fully from the sky outside, the silence between them comfortable now, in a way it had never been before, filled with the quiet, fragile beginnings of something neither of them had expected to find in the wreckage of a forced bond and a desperate escape. It was Priya who found them there later, apologetic for the interruption, but carrying news that immediately shifted the mood of the room. "Forgive me," she said, "but a messenger has arrived from the northern border. It's urgent, my lord. He says the Ashcombe pack has been spotted moving through territory that borders our own, closer than they've come in years." Draven's expression shifted instantly, the softness of moments before giving way to the sharp focus of a leader assessing a threat. "How many?" "A significant number, according to the scouts," Priya said, enough to suggest more than a simple border patrol. Draven rose immediately, though he paused to look back at Kale, something apologetic in his expression. "I need to see to this." "I understand," Kale said, though a knot of unease had settled in her stomach at the mention of an unfamiliar pack moving so close to Blackthorn territory. "Go. We can talk more later." He nodded, and after a brief hesitation, reached out to gently squeeze her hand, before following Priya from the room, leaving Kale alone, with her thoughts and the fading light beyond the window. She sat there for a long while afterward, turning over everything that had passed between them, the honesty, the vulnerability, the quiet admission of feelings she had not expected to develop so quickly toward a man she had once run from with everything she had. But beneath the warmth of that realization, a new unease had begun to take root, the mention of the Ashcombe pack settling uncomfortably in her mind. She did not know much about the politics beyond Blackthorn's borders, had never needed to before her arrival here, but something in Priya's urgency, in the sudden shift in Draven's demeanor, told her this was not a small matter to be easily resolved. Whatever peace she had begun to find inside these walls, whatever fragile trust had begun to grow between herself and the king she had once feared, it seemed a new storm was gathering on the horizon, one that had nothing to do with old grudges or family rivalries, and everything to do with a threat neither of them yet fully understood. News of the Ashcombe pack's movement spread through Blackthorn Hall by morning, and with it came a tension Kale had not felt since her first days within these walls. Where once the hall had buzzed with the quiet warmth of daily life, now she noticed clusters of enforcers speaking in low, urgent tones, messengers coming and going at all hours, and a general sense of watchfulness that settled over everyone like a heavy cloak. She found herself excluded from most of it, left to hear fragments secondhand from Priya, or to piece together the situation from the worried glances exchanged around her. It frustrated her more than she expected. Weeks ago, she might have welcomed being kept apart from pack politics, grateful for any distance from a life she had never asked for. Now, having begun to feel some sense of belonging within these walls, being shut out of decisions that clearly threatened everyone she had come to care about, left her feeling helpless in a way she was determined not to accept quietly. She found Draven late in the evening, hunched over a wide table in his study covered in maps marked with small carved figures, indicating troop movements along the northern border. He looked exhausted, dark circles forming beneath his eyes, his usual composure fraying slightly at the edges. "You've been avoiding me," Cale said from the doorway, and Draven looked up, guilt flickering briefly across his tired features. "I haven't meant to," he said. "There has simply been little time for anything beyond this." He gestured toward the map spread across his desk. "The Ashcombe Pack has not moved this openly toward our border in over a decade. I need to understand their intentions before I can decide how to respond." Cale crossed the room and studied the maps herself, the carved figures marking positions she did not fully understand but could sense the weight of nonetheless. "Tell me what's happening," she said. "All of it, not the simplified version you think I can handle. The truth." Draven hesitated, and for a moment, Cale feared he might retreat back into the same protective secrecy that had defined their earliest days together, withholding information out of some misguided attempt to shield her from difficulty. But then he sighed, some of the tension easing from his shoulders, and pulled out a chair beside his own. "Sit," he said, "and I will explain." Over the next hour, he laid out everything he knew. The Ashcombe Pack had long harbored resentment toward Blackthorn territory, dating back to a border dispute generations old that had never been fully resolved, only quieted through careful diplomacy and the occasional show of strength. Their current alpha, a woman named Ilsa Ashcombe, had inherited leadership only recently, and unlike her more cautious predecessor, she had shown little interest in maintaining the fragile peace between the two territories. "There are rumors," Draven said grimly, "that she intends to test Blackthorn's strength, to see whether the instability of recent months, Calix's exile, the disruption it caused among our senior leadership, has left us vulnerable. If she believes we are weakened, she may attempt to reclaim territory her family has long argued was wrongly taken from them generations ago." "And if she does," Cale asked quietly, "what happens?" "War," Draven said simply, the word landing heavily in the quiet room. "One I would very much like to avoid, if there is any way to do so without simply surrendering land and resources that thousands of pack members depend upon for survival." Cale studied the maps again, an idea slowly forming in her mind, tentative at first but growing steadier the more she considered it. "What if the disruption Calix caused wasn't a weakness to exploit," she said slowly, "but something you could turn into a strength instead?" Draven looked up at her, curious despite his exhaustion. "What do you mean?" "You exiled a threat to your own leadership publicly, in front of the entire pack, without hesitation, even though he was family," Cale continued, warming to the idea as she spoke. "That's not a sign of weakness. That's a sign of exactly how seriously you take the well-being of your pack, even when it costs you personally. If Ilsa Ashcombe believes Calix's exile represents instability, perhaps the right approach isn't to hide that story, but to make certain she hears the full truth of it, told the way it actually happened." Draven considered this for a long moment, something thoughtful entering his tired expression. "You're suggesting I send word of my own accord, before she has the chance to draw her own conclusions from rumor alone?" "Exactly," Cale said. "Show her a leader who acts decisively to protect his people, not one scrambling to hold together a fracturing pack. If she's testing your strength based on assumptions, give her the truth instead, and let that truth speak for itself." A slow, genuine smile spread across Draven's face, the first Cale had seen from him in days. "That is remarkably clever," he said. "I should have thought to consult you on matters like this far sooner than I have." Warmth spread through Cale's chest at the praise, though she tried not to let it show too plainly. "I've spent my whole life watching decisions get made without my input," she said. "I notice things, when I'm paying attention. It's easier to see clearly from the outside sometimes." "Then I would very much like you to keep paying attention," Draven said, his voice carrying a sincerity that left no doubt he meant the words fully. "Not simply as someone I care for, Cale, but as someone whose judgment I have come to trust. If you're willing, I would like your voice included in how we navigate this, not kept apart from it." The offer settled over Cale with a weight she had not expected, gratitude mixing with a fierce, protective determination. She had not fully realized she carried for this pack, for these people who had, against every expectation she once held, become something close to a home to her. "I'm willing," she said firmly. "More than willing." Over the following days, Kale found herself increasingly present in the discussions that shaped Blackthorn's response to the growing threat along its border. She sat in on meetings with senior enforcers, offered her perspective when strategies were debated, and slowly earned the quiet respect of pack members, who had initially viewed her only as the Omega who had once tried to run from their king. Halen, in particular, seemed to warm to her presence in these discussions, occasionally seeking her opinion directly, rather than simply tolerating her attendance. "You have a sharper mind for this than most people give you credit for," she told Kale one afternoon, after a particularly tense strategy session. "Draven made a wise choice, including you in these matters. Whether he fully realized that wisdom himself when he first did it, I couldn't say. I think he's surprised himself more than once these past weeks," Kale said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Good," Halen said, with something that might have been approval. "A king who surprises himself by growing better, rather than worse, is exactly the kind of king this pack needs, especially now." Despite the growing tension along the northern border, despite the very real danger the Ashcombe Pack's movements represented, Kale found herself, in these weeks of preparation and careful diplomacy, discovering a version of herself she had not known existed before her time at Blackthorn Hall began. Not a frightened girl running from a future forced upon her, but a woman with a sharp mind and a genuine voice, standing beside a king who had come, slowly and honestly, to value both. It was not the life she had once imagined for herself, back before any of this began, but increasingly, standing in these war rooms, offering counsel that was genuinely heard, walking through gardens in the evening, beside a man whose guarded heart had opened to her one honest conversation at a time, Kale found herself wondering if perhaps this unexpected life might be a far better one than the freedom she had once run so desperately to find. The threat gathering along the northern border remained, unresolved and dangerous, but for the first time since her arrival at Blackthorn Hall, Kale faced it not as a prisoner, awaiting whatever fate others decided for her, but as someone with a genuine stake in the outcome, standing firmly beside the king she had once feared, and now, increasingly, trusted. The decision to send a formal envoy to the Ashcombe Pack was not made lightly. Draven spent 3 full days weighing the risks with his senior enforcers, Kale among them now, seated at the long table where such decisions were made, rather than waiting anxiously outside the door for news filtered through others. In the end, they agreed that a direct meeting, arranged carefully and on neutral ground, offered the best chance of avoiding the war that loomed increasingly likely with every day the Ashcombe Pack continued its movements along the border. "I want you there," Draven told Kale the evening before they were set to depart, finding her in the garden where she had taken to spending her quiet moments. "Not because I doubt my own judgment, but because yours has proven itself sound, and because Ilsa Ashcombe should understand exactly what kind of partnership stands behind Blackthorn's leadership now." Kale felt a flicker of nervous anticipation at the request, though she did not hesitate before agreeing. "I want to be there," she said honestly. "Whatever happens with this pack, I want to understand it firsthand, not secondhand through reports." They departed at dawn 2 days later, a modest party of enforcers accompanying them to the agreed meeting point, a wide clearing near the border that had, generations ago, served as neutral ground for negotiations between the two territories. Kale rode beside Draven for most of the journey, watching the landscape shift from the cultivated lands near Blackthorn Hall into wilder, rockier terrain as they approached the border. "What is she like?" Kale asked at one point. "This Ilsa Ashcombe." "I've met her only twice before," Draven admitted, both times briefly, at gatherings that required the presence of every territory's leadership. "She struck me as sharp, ambitious, and deeply unconvinced that her predecessor's caution ever served her pack's true interests. Whether that ambition can be reasoned with remains to be seen." They reached the clearing shortly after midday, and Kale's breath caught slightly at the sight of the Ashcombe party already waiting, considerably larger than the modest group Draven had brought, though he had assured her beforehand that such displays were common in these negotiations, more about projecting confidence than genuine threat. Ilsa Ashcombe stood at the front of her party, a tall woman with sharp features and dark hair, pulled back severely from her face, her posture radiating a confidence that bordered on challenge. She studied Draven and Kale as they approached with open, calculating interest. "King Draven," she said, her voice carrying easily across the clearing. "It has been some time." "Alpha Ashcombe," Draven replied, his tone carefully neutral, betraying none of the tension Kale knew he carried beneath the surface. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet." Ilsa's gaze shifted to Kale, assessing her with the same sharp calculation. "And this must be the Omega I've heard so much about. The one who ran, and was caught, and has apparently decided to stay." Something almost amused flickered across her expression. "Rumors travel quickly, even across borders." "I'm here as more than a rumor, Alpha Ashcombe," Kale said, meeting the woman's gaze steadily despite the nerves fluttering in her stomach. "I'm here because Blackthorn's future concerns me directly, and because I believe war between our territories serves neither of our people well." Something in Kale's steady confidence seemed to catch Ilsa's genuine interest, her earlier amusement giving way to something more thoughtful. "Bold words, from someone I understand only recently accepted her place in that future. Bold words from someone who has spent enough of her life having decisions made for her to understand exactly how much needless suffering comes from leaders who act on assumption rather than truth," Kale replied. The clearing fell quiet for a moment, and Kale wondered if she had overstepped, before Ilsa's mouth curved into something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Very well," she said. "Let us speak truth then, and see where it leads us." The negotiations that followed stretched through the afternoon, tense at times, punctuated by moments where old grievances threatened to derail the entire conversation. Ilsa spoke of the border dispute that had simmered for generations, of resources her people believed had been unfairly claimed by Blackthorn territory decades ago, of a growing frustration among her own pack members, who felt their previous leadership had allowed old wrongs to go unaddressed for too long. Draven, for his part, listened more than he spoke, and Kale watched with quiet admiration as he acknowledged the legitimacy of certain grievances, without conceding ground that would leave Blackthorn genuinely vulnerable, carefully steering the conversation toward compromise rather than confrontation. It was during a brief pause in negotiations, while both parties took a moment to consult privately among themselves, that Kale noticed something that sent an uneasy chill through her. Among the Ashcombe party, standing slightly apart from the others, half hidden beneath the shadow of a wide cloak, she caught a glimpse of a familiar face. Calix. She grabbed Draven's arm urgently, pulling his attention away from his conversation with Halen. "Look," she whispered, nodding subtly toward the figure. Near the trees, behind Ilsa's advisors. Draven's expression darkened instantly as he followed her gaze, recognition and fury crossing his features in quick succession. "That's not possible," he murmured, though the evidence stood plainly before them. By the time the negotiations resumed, Calix had disappeared entirely from view, though the discovery settled uneasily over both Draven and Kale for the remainder of the meeting. When the formal discussions finally concluded, both sides agreeing tentatively to a framework for continued negotiation rather than immediate conflict, Draven requested a private word with Ilsa before their parties departed. "Your advisors include a man who was recently exiled from Blackthorn territory for threatening the safety of my mate," Draven said bluntly, once they had stepped away from the wider gathering. "I would like to understand why." Ilsa's expression grew guarded, though not entirely surprised, suggesting she had anticipated this confrontation eventually arising. "Your cousin approached my council several weeks ago," she said carefully. "He offered information regarding Blackthorn's internal instability, suggesting the pack's leadership was more fractured than commonly believed, and that our territory might find opportunity in that fracture." Kale felt her stomach drop at the confirmation of what she had already begun to suspect. "He's the reason your movements along our border escalated," she said slowly. "Not simple ambition on your part. His encouragement." Ilsa's jaw tightened slightly, an admission in itself. "I will not pretend my pack's grievances against Blackthorn territory are not genuine and long-standing," she said. "But I will admit, his information influenced the timing of our approach more than I initially recognized. Whether that influence colored my judgment poorly remains something I intend to consider carefully, now that the truth of it stands before me." "He wants a war between our territories," Draven said grimly. "Not for the sake of either pack's genuine interests, but because instability serves his own ambitions, to reclaim leadership, he believes was wrongfully denied him. Ilsa was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing this new information against everything she had previously believed about the situation. I do not make my decisions based on the manipulations of exiled cousins seeking to settle old grudges, she said finally, her voice carrying a new firmness. If what you say is true, it changes my assessment of this situation considerably. I will need to reconsider my counsel's recent advice with far more scrutiny than I previously applied. I would appreciate that scrutiny, Draven said, given everything at stake for both our peoples. They parted on terms considerably more cautious than hostile, an agreement to reconvene within the month, once both leaders had time to fully consider the implications of what had been revealed. As their party made the journey back toward Blackthorn Hall, the sun beginning to set behind them, Kale found herself turning the discovery over in her mind, unease settling deep in her chest. He's not finished, she said quietly, as they rode side by side through the darkening forest. Calix, he's found a new way to threaten everything you've built, everything we've built, and this time it's not confined within your own walls, where you can simply exile the danger away. Draven's expression was grim in the fading light. No, he agreed. This time, the danger has grown considerably larger than one bitter cousin seeking power, and I fear, Kale, that we have only begun to see how far he is willing to go to achieve it. The forest around them grew darker as they rode, the weight of the day's revelations settling heavily over the entire party, and Kale found herself reaching instinctively for Draven's hand, needing the steady warmth of his presence against the uncertainty of everything that now lay ahead. He took her hand without hesitation, his fingers lacing through hers with a firmness that spoke of quiet, unshakable resolve. Whatever storm Calix intended to unleash upon them, they would face it together, and for the first time since her arrival at Blackthorn Hall, that certainty gave Kale more comfort than fear. 3 days after the return from the border, Draven called Kale to the hall's oldest chamber, a small circular room tucked deep within the original stone foundation of Blackthorn Hall, one she had never before been permitted to enter. Shelves lined every wall, filled with ancient texts and scrolls far older than anything in the main library, and at the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, bearing a single, weathered book bound in cracked leather. This is where the founding records are kept, Draven explained, as Kale took in the room with wide, curious eyes. The true history of the bond between our bloodlines, not the simplified version passed down through generations of storytelling. I think it's time you understood the whole of it, especially given what we now know of Calix's intentions. He opened the ancient book carefully, its pages brittle with age, and began to explain. The bond between their families, he told her, had not simply been a political arrangement forged to end an old war, as he had explained to her weeks earlier in the garden. It ran deeper than that, tied to a form of protective magic woven into the very foundation of Blackthorn territory generations ago, magic that relied on the union of the two bloodlines to remain strong. When the bond exists as it should, Draven explained, it strengthens the Pack's magical defenses considerably, protections that have kept this territory safe from far worse threats than border disputes over the generations since it was first woven. If the bond is broken, deliberately severed rather than simply delayed, those defenses weaken, significantly. Kale's stomach tightened with a growing understanding. That's what Calix is truly after, she said slowly. Not simply removing me to make you look weak to potential rivals. He wants the bond broken entirely, to weaken Blackthorn's defenses enough that a real threat could move against the Pack more easily, with him positioned to seize control in the chaos that follows. It would explain a great deal, Draven agreed grimly. His alliance with Ashcombe, his earlier attempts to have you removed rather than simply challenging my leadership directly. If the Pack's protections weaken enough, an ambitious rival like Ilsa Ashcombe might find far more successful ground to challenge our territory's stability than she currently possesses, whether she fully understands the true stakes of that opportunity or not. Kale studied the ancient text spread before her, running her fingers gently over pages far older than anything she had ever touched before, filled with a history she had known only in fragments until this moment. How would he even attempt to break something this old, this deeply woven into the Pack's foundation? Draven's expression grew troubled. There are old rituals, he said slowly, dangerous ones, capable of severing a bond forcibly, rather than allowing it to fade naturally through simple separation or rejection. They require considerable power and considerable risk to whoever attempts them. I would not have believed Calix capable of pursuing something so reckless until recent events proved otherwise. A chill settled over Cale at the implication. You think he might actually attempt something like that, against us? I think, Draven said carefully, that we cannot afford to assume otherwise, given everything we now know of his ambitions and his willingness to ally with outside threats to achieve them. He closed the ancient book gently, his expression grave, which means we need to understand exactly how such a ritual might be attempted, and what we would need to do to prevent it, or to counter it, should prevention fail. They spent the following hours combing through the ancient texts together, searching for any record of such rituals having been attempted before, any account of how the founding families had originally protected the bond against exactly this kind of threat. It was slow, difficult work, the old language dense and unfamiliar even to Draven, who had studied these records far more thoroughly than Cale had yet had the chance to. It was Cale, eventually, who found the passage they needed, tucked into a section of the text describing the original ceremony that had first sealed the bond between their bloodlines generations ago. Here, she said, carefully translating the archaic phrasing as best she could. It says the bond, once fully sealed through mutual choice and genuine devotion, becomes resistant to forced severance. That the ritual Calix would need requires the bond to remain incomplete, dependent on obligation, rather than genuine connection, to have any hope of succeeding. Draven read over the passage carefully, something like hope flickering across his tired features. If that's accurate, he said slowly, then the surest way to protect against exactly what Calix intends is not simply defense or vigilance. It's completing the bond as it was originally meant to be completed. Through genuine choice, freely given. Cale looked up at him, understanding the weight of what he was suggesting, her heart pounding at the implication. You mean marriage, she said quietly. Not as an arrangement forced upon me, the way it was first presented all those weeks ago, but as something chosen, honestly, by both of us. I would never ask you to make that choice out of fear of Calix's threats, Draven said quickly, something almost desperate entering his voice. That is not what I want for us, Cale. If this decision is ever made, I want it made because it is genuinely what you want, not because it happens to also serve as protection against a threat we're facing. Cale studied him for a long moment, the weight of everything they had discovered settling over her, the ancient magic, the danger Calix represented, the growing realization of exactly how deeply her fate had become intertwined with this man, and this pack she had once fled with everything she had. But beneath all of that weight, she found something else entirely, something quieter and steadier than fear. She thought of the weeks since her capture in the forest, of every small kindness Draven had shown her, every moment of honesty, every instance where he had chosen her well-being over convenience, or tradition, or even his own family's loyalty. She thought of the woman she had become within these walls, sharper and stronger, and more herself than she had ever felt before arriving here, not despite Draven's presence in her life but, increasingly, because of it. I know what I want, she said finally, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of the moment. I've known for a while now, if I'm honest with myself. I was simply afraid to say it aloud, afraid of how much power that admission would give away. Draven's breath caught slightly, hope and uncertainty warring plainly across his face. And what is it you want? I want to choose this, Cale said, reaching for his hand across the ancient text between them. Not because tradition demands it, and not because Calix's threats make it necessary. Because somewhere between that forest and this room, I stopped seeing you as the cage I was warned about, and started seeing you as someone I genuinely want to build a life alongside. If that means completing this bond, truly, honestly, then yes, that is what I want. The relief and joy that broke across Draven's face in that moment was unlike anything Cale had witnessed from him before, all his careful composure giving way entirely to something raw and unguarded, and deeply, genuinely happy. He rose from his seat and crossed to her side of the small table, kneeling before her chair, his hands gently cupping her face, as he studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You have made me happier in this single moment, he said quietly, than I believed myself capable of being, before you ran through that forest, and changed everything I thought I understood about my own life. He paused, something more serious entering his expression. But Kale, I need you to understand. This choice cannot be made carelessly, given the threat we now know exists. If we move forward with this, we do so with our eyes open to the danger it may draw out of hiding, sooner than we would prefer. I understand, Kale said firmly, and I'm not afraid of facing that danger. Not anymore, not with you beside me. Outside the small circular chamber, the ancient stones of Blackthorn Hall stood silent witness to a choice generations in the making, finally settling into place not through obligation or arranged tradition, but through genuine, hard-won devotion between two people who had begun their journey together as captor and captive, and had found their way, slowly and honestly, to something far more precious than either of them had ever expected to find. But even as hope bloomed between them in that quiet, candlelit room, neither of them could fully shake the knowledge that somewhere beyond Blackthorn's walls, Calix remained free, his ambitions unchecked, his alliance with Ashcombe territory still uncertain in its true intentions, and the danger that threatened everything they had built together had not yet shown its final, most dangerous form. Preparations for the bonding ceremony began quietly at first, deliberately kept from spreading too widely through the hall, until Draven and his senior enforcers had taken every precaution they could think of against the threat Calix represented. Halen doubled the guard along Blackthorn's borders and within the hall itself, and Draven sent careful, private word to Ilsa Ashcombe, informing her of their decision and requesting any information her council might have gathered regarding Calix's current whereabouts or intentions. Ilsa's response arrived within the week, carried by a single trusted messenger rather than a formal envoy, a gesture Kale understood to be significant given the delicate trust still forming between their two territories. The message confirmed what they had feared. Calix had approached members of Ilsa's council again, more recently, this time with considerably more urgency in his requests, seeking access to old texts rumored to exist within Ashcombe territory, texts said to contain instructions for rituals dangerous enough that even Ilsa's predecessor had long ago ordered them sealed away and forbidden. She's refused him access, Draven said, reading the message aloud to Kale and Halen in his study, but she warns that Calix has grown increasingly desperate, and that desperation makes him considerably more dangerous than his earlier attempts at manipulation ever suggested. Desperate men make reckless choices, Halen said grimly. If he cannot obtain what he needs through Ashcombe's cooperation, he may attempt to take it by force, or seek it elsewhere entirely. The ceremony was set to take place 10 days later, during the coming full moon, in accordance with old tradition that held such bonds were strongest when sealed beneath its light. As the day approached, Kale found herself caught between genuine excitement for the choice she had made and a persistent, gnawing unease she could not fully shake, no matter how many precautions Draven and his enforcers put in place around her. The unease proved well-founded. 2 nights before the ceremony, Kale woke suddenly in the depths of the night, her heart pounding, certain something had disturbed her sleep though she could not immediately identify what. She lay still for a moment, listening, and then she heard it again, a soft scrape of sound from somewhere near her window, too deliberate to be simple wind or settling stone. She rose quietly, crossing to the window with careful steps, and peered out into the darkness beyond. For a long moment, she saw nothing but the familiar shapes of the garden below, silvered faintly by moonlight. Then a shadow moved at the edge of the tree line, too large and too purposeful to belong to any ordinary creature of the night. Kale did not hesitate. She hurried from her room and down the corridor toward Draven's chambers, her bare feet silent against the cool stone floor, adrenaline sharpening every sense as she moved. She found him already awake when she reached his door, some instinct of his own apparently having stirred him from sleep at nearly the same moment. "Something's out there," she said breathlessly, before he could ask. "By the eastern tree line. I saw movement." Draven's expression sharpened instantly, all traces of sleep vanishing, as he reached for the sword, kept near his bed, a precaution Kale had not fully registered the significance of until this exact moment. "Stay close to me," he said, already moving toward the door. "We wake Halen first." What followed happened with a speed that left Kale's head spinning even as she fought to keep pace with the unfolding chaos. Halen roused the hall's guard within minutes, enforcers spreading out across the grounds with practiced efficiency, torches flaring to life along the walls as the alarm was raised. Kale stayed close to Draven's side, as he moved through the tense, hurried preparations, refusing to be tucked away safely out of sight, despite his clear instinct to protect her from whatever danger approached. They found Calix near the old chapel at the edge of the grounds, a small stone building rarely used except for the most significant pack ceremonies, precisely because of the ancient, protective symbols carved deep into its foundation stones generations ago. He stood within a rough circle he had clearly been in the process of drawing across the chapel floor, when the enforcer's torches revealed him, a heavy, leather-bound text open on the ground beside him, unmistakably one of the forbidden texts Ilsa had refused him access to through legitimate means. "You didn't think I'd find another way," Calix said, his voice carrying a manic edge Cale had not heard from him before, desperation stripping away the last of his careful, calculating composure. "There are always other ways, cousin. Always someone willing to sell what others refuse to share freely." "Stop this now," Draven said, his voice carrying an authority that cut sharply through the tense air of the chapel, though Cale could hear the genuine worry threaded beneath it. "Whatever you believe this ritual will accomplish, you do not understand what you're truly risking, to yourself and to everyone within these walls." "I understand perfectly," Calix snapped, his hands moving quickly to complete the last markings of the circle he had drawn. "I understand that you have taken everything that should have been mine, and now you intend to seal it permanently, through a bond that will make challenging your leadership impossible for generations to come. I will not allow that to happen, not while I still have breath left to stop it." Cale felt the air in the chapel grow suddenly heavier, a strange pressure building that made her skin prickle uncomfortably, and she realized with mounting horror that whatever ritual Calix had begun was already drawing on power, far beyond simple desperation. Ancient symbols along the circle's edge began to glow faintly, a sickly greenish light that seemed to pulse in time with some unseen heartbeat. "He's already started it," Draven said urgently, turning to Halen. "We need to stop him before it completes, or the damage may be irreversible." Halen moved forward with several enforcers, attempting to close the distance to Calix before the ritual could finish, but the moment they crossed some invisible boundary at the circle's edge, an invisible force threw them backward with startling violence, though thankfully none of them were seriously hurt by the impact against the chapel's stone walls. "You cannot simply force your way through it," Calix called out, something almost triumphant entering his desperate voice now. "The magic protects itself, cousin, just as it once protected your precious bond. How fitting that the same power, keeping me from you, now also keeps everyone else from stopping me." Cale's mind raced, memories of the ancient texts she and Draven had studied together flashing through her thoughts. The bond, they had learned, grew resistant to forced severance once fully sealed through genuine devotion, but their bond had not yet been formally completed, the ceremony still 2 days away. Calix had chosen his moment carefully, striking in the narrow window before their protection could fully take hold. "There has to be a way to stop this without breaking through the barrier physically," she said urgently to Draven, her mind working quickly, even as fear tightened her chest. "The text said the ritual requires the bond to remain incomplete to succeed. What if we complete it now, here, in whatever way we can, even without the formal ceremony?" Draven turned to look at her, understanding dawning rapidly across his features. "A binding declaration," he said. "Spoken freely, with genuine intent, witnessed by pack members present. It would not carry the full weight of the formal ceremony, but it might be enough to shift the balance of what Calix's ritual requires to succeed." "Then let's try it," Cale said firmly, stepping forward, despite the danger still radiating from the glowing circle before them. Draven turned to face her fully, and despite the chaos and danger surrounding them, his eyes carried the same steady certainty she had come to know so well over the past weeks. "Cale," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough for the gathered enforcers to hear. "I choose you, freely, as my mate, not out of duty or tradition, but because you have become the truest partner I could ever hope to stand beside, in this fight, and in every fight yet to come." "I choose you too," Cale answered immediately, her own voice steady, despite the danger surrounding them, despite the strange pressure still building in the air around Calix's circle. "Freely and completely, as the man I have come to love more than I ever believed possible, given how our story began." The moment the words left her lips, the greenish light pulsing from Calix's circle flared violently, before beginning, rapidly, to dim. Calix's expression twisted from triumph into horrified disbelief. As the power he had been drawing upon began to unravel around him, the ancient symbols fading back into ordinary stone, the pressure in the air releasing all at once, with a force that sent him stumbling backward, the heavy text falling from his hands. "No," he gasped, staring down at the now inert circle in disbelief. "That's not possible. It should not have worked this quickly." "Genuine devotion doesn't wait for ceremony to become real, cousin," Draven said, moving forward now that the barrier had clearly fallen, Halen and the other enforcers quickly closing in around Calix before he could attempt any further desperate action. "It only waits for honesty." Calix offered no further resistance as the enforcers restrained him. His earlier desperate confidence collapsed entirely into something hollow and defeated. Kale watched, still catching her breath from the danger and the sudden, unexpected weight of the declaration she had just made, as Halen led him away into the custody that would, this time, likely prove far more permanent than his earlier exile. Draven turned back to her once the chapel had emptied, his expression a complicated mixture of relief and wonder. "You just declared yourself bonded to me," he said quietly, "in the middle of a crisis, without any of the ceremony or preparation we had planned." "I meant every word of it," Kale said, stepping closer to him, the adrenaline of the danger finally beginning to fade into something warmer and steadier. "Ceremony or not." Draven reached for her then, pulling her gently into his arms, and Kale allowed herself, finally, to simply rest against him, the danger past, the truth of everything she had declared settling comfortably into place within her chest. "Then let us still hold the formal ceremony in 2 days' time," he said softly, "not because it is required to protect us any longer, but because I would like the entire pack to witness what you have already given me freely, here, tonight." Outside the old chapel, the first hint of dawn began to color the eastern sky. The danger of that long night finally passed, leaving behind only the quiet, hard-won certainty of a bond chosen freely, tested under fire, and found, in the end, to be exactly as strong as it needed to be. 2 days later, Blackthorn Hall came alive, in a way Kale had never seen before, every corridor filled with the warm bustle of preparation. Flowers gathered from the gardens woven through the great hall's stone archways, long tables set beneath the open sky in the courtyard, where the ceremony would take place beneath the coming full moon. Word of Calix's defeated ritual had spread quickly through the pack, and rather than fear, Kale found the mood among the gathered pack members to be one of quiet celebration, as though the crisis had only strengthened everyone's sense of what truly mattered. Priya helped her dress that evening, her hands careful and steady, despite the excitement clearly written across her face. "I still remember the night you arrived back here," Priya said softly, adjusting the delicate fabric of Kale's gown, soaked from the river, terrified, certain your whole future had just been stolen from you. "I don't think either of us could have imagined this evening, back then." "No," Kale agreed, studying her own reflection in the small mirror propped against the wall, hardly recognizing the calm, steady woman looking back at her. "I couldn't have imagined any of this." "Do you regret it?" Priya asked gently. "Any of it, the running, the capture, everything that led you here?" Kale considered the question seriously before answering. "I don't regret running," she said finally. "I think I needed to prove to myself that I could fight for my own future, even if that fight didn't end the way I originally hoped. But I also don't regret being caught, strange as that sounds. Everything that's happened since that night has led me here, to a life I chose freely, with a man I've come to love completely. I wouldn't trade that for the freedom I thought I wanted that first night in the forest." Priya smiled warmly, squeezing her hand once before stepping back to admire her work. "Then let's not keep him waiting any longer." The courtyard, when Kale finally stepped out into it, took her breath away entirely. Hundreds of pack members had gathered beneath the darkening sky, torches lining the stone walls, the full moon just beginning to rise above the eastern towers. Draven stood waiting at the center of it all, dressed formally for the first time since she had known him, and the expression on his face as she approached, open wonder mixed with a joy he made no effort to hide, settled deep and warm into her chest. Halen conducted the ceremony, her usually stern voice softened considerably, as she spoke the old words that had bound their family's bloodlines together for generations. Words that carried far more meaning now, spoken freely, than they ever could have carried as simple obligation. When it came time for their own vows, Draven took both of Kale's hands in his his gray eyes steady and warm in the torchlight. "I met you first, as a king determined to secure his pack's future through duty alone," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet courtyard. "I nearly lost you to that same misguided sense of duty, through choices I made poorly, out of fear I did not yet understand how to face honestly. You taught me, through your courage and your honesty, what it truly means to lead with an open heart rather than a guarded one. I promise you, Kale, for as long as I draw breath, to never again mistake control for care, or duty for devotion. I choose you, freely and completely, today and every day that follows." Kale felt tears gather in her eyes, unable to fully hold back the emotion of the moment, as she found her own voice to answer him. "I came to this hall as a captive," she said, "terrified of the future I believed had been forced upon me. I leave that fear behind me tonight, not because the choice was ever taken from me in the end, but because you gave it back to me, patiently, honestly, one truth at a time, until I found myself choosing you, not out of obligation, but out of genuine, complete love. I choose you too, Draven, freely, and for the rest of my life." The courtyard erupted into warm celebration, as Halen pronounced their bond formally sealed, the full moon now risen fully above the towers, bathing the entire gathering in silver light. Kale found herself swept up in the joy of the moment, surrounded by people who had, over these past months, become far more than simply the pack she had once feared, but a genuine community she was proud to call her own. Later that evening, once the formal celebrations had given way to quieter conversation and dancing beneath the stars, Draven found her standing near the edge of the courtyard, watching the festivities, with a contentment she had never expected to feel within these walls. "Regrets?" he asked softly, echoing Priya's earlier question, though his tone carried a gentle teasing, rather than genuine uncertainty. "None," Kale said, leaning into him, as his arms settled comfortably around her shoulders. "Though I imagine future historians might find it strange that our story began with me running from you through a forest in the middle of the night." Draven's laugh was warm and genuine, a sound she had come to treasure over these past months, for how rarely it had come easily to him before their bond began to grow. "Let them find it strange," he said. "I rather like that our story began with you fighting for a future you believed was worth running for, and ended with you choosing, freely, to build that future here, beside me, instead." "It's not ended," Kale pointed out, smiling up at him. "It's only beginning." "Yes," Draven agreed, pulling her closer as they watched the celebration continue around them. The danger of Calix's betrayal now firmly behind them. The future ahead, full of possibility, rather than fear. "I believe it is." Above them, the full moon continued its slow climb across the clear night sky, casting its silver light over Blackthorn Hall, and the two people standing together at its heart, no longer king and captive, no longer hunter and prey, but simply two people who had found, against every expectation either of them once carried, a love worth choosing freely, again and again, for the rest of their lives together. And somewhere far beyond the walls of the hall, in the quiet darkness of the forest where their story had first truly begun, the same wind that had once carried the sound of hunting horns now carried only the distant, peaceful sound of celebration, a fitting end to a story that had started with running and found its true home, at last, in staying.